Let's do something positive for a change. So far, my channel has been heavily based around critiquing the lore of champions in League of Legends or rewriting their backstories to offer my own interpretations of the characters. I've realized recently that this might make it seem like I have an overall negative view of the roster, so today I want to take a step back and talk about some of the best backstories Riot has put out over the years. In my personal opinion, at least. Simply put, I'm going to pick my favorite champion from each region, give a brief synopsis of their lore, and talk about why I think they work so well. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? So picking a favorite champion from Ionia was actually kind of hard given how many characters are actually from this region, but after thinking it over for a time, I've gotta say I have a soft spot for Wukong. Yes, he is yet another Sun Wukong reference among dozens in modern media, if not hundreds. But putting that aside, I think his story is genuinely pretty well executed. In keeping with his inspiration from Journey to the West, Wukong's story is one of humility, albeit it's much shorter than the source material. Starting out as simply Kong, this lone Shimon was exiled from his home after a prank went too far, and so he wound up wandering the land to pick fights and play pranks to his heart's content. Until he wound up angering Noxian's soldiers with his antics during their invasion. This serves as something of a reality check for Kong. He was kicked out for tricking his kind into thinking that an angry dragon was burning down their home, but then he got to see what such devastation looked like firsthand, with Noxian forces burning down forests and villages. Realizing the severity of the situation, he seeks out the Masters of Wuju, an ancient Ionian fighting style, but found that only one remained among the rubble of the village where the art was once taught. What we have from here is a typical story about a brash student being humbled over and over again by a wise old master figure. But Yi is far from your typical wise old master. He's left in a state of melancholy from being unable to protect his home, and Wukong's boundless spirit turned out to be just what Yi needed to pick himself back up. The two wound up traveling Ionia together to face injustice wherever they could find it, learning and growing from each other all the while. You could say that it's just as much of a found family dynamic as simply being master and student, which I think is a fairly unique twist on the whole premise. It's all a bit cliché, sure, but it's a cliché done well. More than that, I admire how Riot managed to tie in parallels with Wukong's obvious mythology roots, while still making this Wukong seem like his own character. I'm greatly looking forward to seeing where his journey takes him from here. If the Freljord had a protagonist, it would probably be Ashe. She's one of the first champions to ever be released, after all, and her goal has remained pretty consistent since her release. Unite the warring tribes of the Freljord under a single banner. However, Ashe's latest retcon in the universe has added an interesting twist on the matter that gives her idealistic dream a lot more nuance than it used to have. Basically, Ashe is selling herself as the reincarnation of Avarosa, a legendary heroine who united the Freljord long ago along with her sister, Cyrilda. Though the truth of the sister's demise has been all but forgotten, in no small part thanks to Lyssandra's efforts, people still remember and revere Avarosa throughout the entire Freljord. People believe that Ashe must be her reincarnation, because she found the heroine's long-lost bow. Or did she? In truth, Ashe's bow was claimed from an unmarked grave on top of a mountain. We don't know who was buried there, but given that Avarosa actually died at the Howling Abyss, the odds of this bow being Avarosa's are, well, it's dubious to say the least. Ashe knows this, and yet she's still claiming to be the second coming of Avarosa, despite not fully believing it herself. But don't misunderstand. Ashe isn't doing it for fame or recognition or power. Her dream to unite the Freljord is genuine. She's tired of watching tribes have to fight and kill each other over resources. She's tired of seeing families and homes torn apart every winter because there's not enough to go around. Ashe truly believes that they can build the Freljord into something more than a land where survival of the fittest is the only law, but she knows that many hearts are as cold as the climate they live in. In a way, Ashe is exploiting the people's superstitious nature for her cause. But that cause is a new future where all people of the Freljord are united as one. Is she in the right? Is her dream worth the deception? Furthermore, how long can Ashe bear the guilt of this lie? The Freljord has some great characters, but Ashe's potential for future growth makes her my personal favorite of the region. To be honest, I sometimes almost forget that Morgana is a Demacian champion. She's been almost entirely absent from the main plot happening in the kingdom, the Mage Rebellion, which is an absolute shame. Morgana is half of the aspect of justice, basically the celestial god who deals in punishing the wicked. While her sister, Kael, deals in striking down the guilty, Morgana prefers to make them repent and atone for their crimes. These two twins had the fortune, or perhaps misfortune, of their mother being selected as the aspect's host before they were even born. As a result, they possess traces of celestial power from birth, making them ideal candidates for the Justice's next vessel. Unfortunately, splitting itself between the sisters caused Justice to manifest in two somewhat conflicting forms. This inevitably led to a clash between the sisters' ideologies, and their battle was one to behold. Unfortunately, their father wasn't keen on just sitting back and watching his daughters kill each other, which ultimately led to him getting caught in the crossfire. Tragically, he perished, finally causing both sisters to cease their feud. Kael simply left, intent on fully embracing her divinity, while Morgana rejected the power she'd been born with, shackling her own wings. Kael went on to become the icon of an entire religion, while Morgana let herself fade into obscurity. Despite that, she never stopped fully being an aspect of justice, even if she refuses to consider herself a deity. Morgana continues to work in the shadows of Demacia, teaching important lessons to the wicked and corrupt. Her power allows her to make people feel the pain they've caused others, both physical and emotional. She quite literally overwhelms you with guilt and tries to make you change your ways. Really, though, what makes Morgana so interesting to me is not what she does, but how she views herself and her actions. She chooses to live as a human in spite of her divinity, yet still carries out the mission given to her of her own convictions. I do hope we see more of her in the future, whenever and however Riot chooses to continue Demacia's story. You'd think following the same redemption arc since 2011 would get tiresome, but Riven just makes it work. Born and raised in Noxus, Riven naturally grew up believing in the Noxian ideals of strength, that anyone could better their lot in life if they had the grit and will to climb the ladder. Riven certainly proved her mettle, going from an orphan on a farm to a soldier recognized by even government officials. So great was her skill and dedication to the Empire that Riven was even given a runic blade by Borim Darkwill himself, the previous Grand General. The chance to put that blade to use would come in the form of the Noxian invasion of Ionia, but as dedicated as Riven was to her empire, Noxus wasn't so dedicated to her. Though Ionia was a land where large-scale wars were practically a foreign concept, Noxus quickly found that the land itself would prove a formidable enemy. After all, Ionia is a place where the borders between the physical and spiritual realms are thin, and the island itself can literally come to life to drive off those that would threaten it. Needless to say, conquest becomes a lot more complicated when you literally have to conquer the battlefield itself. So Noxus started resorting to more unsavory tactics in an effort to establish dominance. Deploying child soldiers, unleashing chemical weapons, basically all of the war crimes. As stated in Riven's bio, Noxus eventually became obsessed more with proving a point than expanding its empire, and Riven witnessed her own brothers and sisters in arms being blown to hell alongside Ionian resistance forces. Riven herself only survived because of her magic sword, but what she once viewed as a badge of honor quickly became a reminder of how corrupt Noxus truly was at its core. I think what makes Riven so compelling is that her character tackles a myriad of real psychological issues: PTSD, survivor's guilt, and a complete loss of faith in an institution she devoted her life to say the least. Since the war, she's spent every waking moment trying to distance herself from Noxus and leave the battlefield behind her. But of course, this is Runeterra, so the world seems intent on putting her back into the fight in some form or another. I'm not sure where her character arc is going to go after the mess that was the Sentinels event, but hopefully we'll get to see Riven continue her journey of self-redemption in due time. Perhaps she can meet up with Rel and help rebel against the Noxian Empire? Just a thought. The Ship of Theseus, one of the most well-known paradoxes of all time. If you slowly replace every part of a ship piece by piece, is it still the same vessel when you're done? This idea is the core of Orianna's story, and it's one of the most beautifully tragic tales in all of Runeterra, in my opinion. Born to the prosthetics maker Korin Revik, Orianna was a young girl full of empathy for other people. She was the sort of person who hated standing by while others suffered, which is what led her to sneaking out of her home one night and offering her assistance to Zonites suffering from a spill of poisonous gases. Though her efforts helped save a lot of lives, the aforementioned gases infected Orianna's lungs, putting her in critical condition. In desperation, her father managed to create a set of artificial lungs, prolonging Orianna's life. Unfortunately, this was far from the end of their woes. The infection continued to spread throughout Orianna's body, forcing Korin to amputate and replace more of her body over time. To his credit, it does seem like Orianna went along with these changes, but I think you can see where this is going. The story says that at a certain point, only Orianna's organic heart remained. Yes, somehow, Korin was seemingly able to even create an artificial brain for his daughter. Though in a world with hex tech, maybe that's not so far-fetched. Regardless, even the organic heart wouldn't last forever, as Orianna would transfuse that into her father when he fell ill, effectively making herself completely a machine. No longer believing herself to have a place in her father's workshop, Orianna once again set out on her own, this time trying to figure out, as her story puts it, where in the world's vast machine she might fit. Orianna's story is centered around some of the oldest philosophical questions in history: the nature of identity and what it truly means to be human. She is, in my opinion, one of the most criminally underutilized characters in all of Piltover and Zaun, and I seriously want to know where she is and what she's gotten up to since nearly stealing an automaton from a fair out of a misplaced sense of kinship. Maybe we'll get lucky and see a cameo of her in Arcane Season 2, but either way, I'm looking forward to whatever the future has in store for the Lady of Clockwork. I don't like being too predictable or just following the fan favorite opinions, but Ekko is hands down my favorite Zonite. Much like Ashe in the Freljord, Ekko is basically designed to be the protagonist of his region, and he's a damn good protagonist. Now, admittedly, his bio on Universe and his story in Arcane tell two somewhat conflicting versions of events, but the story is still the same at its heart. Ekko was born in Zaun, the underbelly of Piltover that suffers from a literal class divide between the upper class and lower class citizens. While most see Zaun as a borderline lawless place filled with thugs and toxic runoff, Ekko sees his home differently. He sees streets filled with vibrant people just trying to live the best lives they can, full of just as much potential as the Pilties above them. Ekko is living proof of that belief. He's a child prodigy that not only brought together the orphan children of Zaun to create a safe haven for them, he's also basically created a time machine. While you could argue that Zillion and his Acathian disciples did it first, Ekko's Z-Drive is quite unlike anything else in Piltover or Zaun. Though it has its limits, Ekko can basically use the Z-Drive to save scum reality, rewinding time up to a certain point to do things over and over again until he gets the ideal outcome. But even with such power in his hands, Ekko knows and understands that there are some things that just can't be undone. He fights not just to alter the past, but to create a new, better future for the people of Zaun. Ekko is a rebel, defying corrupt authority figures like the Kimbarons and the Piltovan aristocrats alike. It's easy to see why people gravitate towards him in that regard. But unlike other rebellious characters in the game, such as Silas and Urgot, he's not portrayed as antagonistic. He genuinely wants to just live his best life, doing what he can to help make Zaun a better place for the people who live there. Ekko's not out to tear down the establishment that oppresses his people, but to raise his people up and show that Zaunites can have just as much ingenuity and intellect as Piltovans, just in their own way. Simply put, what makes Ekko such a compelling character is that he's relatable. It's easy to see why he's become one of the most popular characters in the game, to the point that Riot has even greenlit Ekko having his own spin-off game. I'm very excited to see what the future has in store for this kid. After all, the future is whatever he makes it. We've talked a lot about mostly heroic characters on this list, but now it's time to tackle one of my favorite villains in League, if not fiction in general. Xerath's story is complex. So much so that I honestly don't think I can do it justice in this video alone. Nevertheless, I'm going to try. Xerath's story reminds me a lot of the tale of Moses and Ramses II in the Prince of Egypt movie. A slave who wound up forming a brotherly bond with a prince. Make no mistake though, unlike Moses, Xerath is no liberator. Not for anyone but himself, at least. Xerath and Azir are two different examples of extreme egos. If the former has a god complex, then the latter has a messiah complex. Xerath believes that he deserves to rule simply because he has the power to make others submit to him, while Azir thinks himself destined to lead the world to eternal glory and prosperity. Between them, however, I find Xerath a bit more interesting. I don't agree with his ideals or his actions, but his bio quote gives a pretty good look into why he is the way he is. A lifetime as a slave has prepared me for eternity as this world's master. Xerath is a man with a twisted idea of freedom, in which he believes that he can only be truly free by ruling over anyone and anything that would try to deny him that freedom. In a way, you could view him as the ultimate karma for the Shriman Empire. They spent centuries misusing the power of ascension to oppress and enslave people, and then one of their slaves used that same power to dethrone the emperor and throw the entire nation into chaos. But in all honesty, there's a much simpler reason to love Xerath beyond delving into his psychology and character. Xerath is just a great villain. I've always had a love for menacing antagonists. Characters whose very presence exudes, "Do not mess with me if you value your life." As a guy literally made of pure arcane power, Xerath is easily one of the strongest entities on all of Runeterra. So much so that his strength even dwarfs that of most other Ascended. He can conjure storms, mind control people, absorb energy, turn people into energy monsters, and who even knows what else. A lot of characters want to rule the world, but Xerath seems like one of the few who could legitimately pull it off if he played his cards right. It's only a shame that Riot doesn't elaborate on his story more. I mean, every time Xerath shows up, it feels like Riot just skips forward several steps. He escaped from the tomb, then somehow took over a city. Next time we see him, he's attacking another city with a mind-controlled army. Then he's suddenly fighting Atreus for some reason. Now he's building monuments throughout the desert and has an army of energy monsters. Like, you take your eyes off this guy for one moment and suddenly he's doing some new crazy nonsense somewhere else in Shurima. I really hope Riot slows down and actually takes some time to properly establish what Xerath's doing the next time he shows up. It's a little disappointing seeing him constantly relegated to a background character in other stories, when he's easily one of the biggest threats residing in all of Shurima. I feel like I hardly even need to justify or explain my choice here. Pantheon, aka Atreus, is just badass. Everything this guy says and does is pure hype. From picking fights with cosmic gods out of spite, to inspiring everyone around him to fight against impossible odds. Even before becoming an aspect, he trained relentlessly to better himself, picking himself back up after every defeat to grow stronger. He's one of the few people to ever successfully scale Targon without some manner of divine assistance, even when his arguably more capable friend, Pylus, failed. Unfortunately, that turned out to be a mistake, as the aspect of war doesn't play by the same rules as the others. Instead of making a pact with his host like the other deities, Pantheon just completely took over Atreus' body, using it to hunt down the Darkin, only to lose to Aatrox and get himself killed. Aatrox's sword was able to do a blow that killed the war god inside of Atreus, leaving the man to rot and bleed out. And yet, through sheer force of will, Atreus survived and crawled to safety. After having his wounds tended to by Eula, Atreus proceeded to go challenge Aatrox for a rematch, and actually won by using the remnants of the divine power left over in his body. From that day forth, Atreus devoted himself to fighting gods, demons, and any other tyrannical entity that would use mortals as nothing more than playthings. People have compared Atreus to Kratos from God of War, but Atreus isn't out for revenge against the higher powers. He wants to protect others from them, so that no one has to go through what he did. Atreus wants to prove that mortals are more than just puppets to be controlled by greater powers. And so far, he's done a pretty good job. At least until the Sentinels of Light event, where Viego brought Pantheon back and caused Atreus to spiral into depression as a result. Look, I've already given my thoughts on that before, even wrote an entire fanfic dealing with the fallout of that event, so I won't delve too deeply into it right now. All I'll say is that it would be interesting to see him go through a canon redemption arc of some kind, fully embracing his role as the new god of war while continuing to embrace his humanity. Whatever direction Riot decides to take him, though, Atreus is absolutely the sort of hero that Runeterra needs. In the face of gods, demons, eldritch horrors, and undead overlords, it's good to know that there's someone out there willing to look out for humanity. Given how few champions there are associated with the region, you'd think it wouldn't be hard to find a favorite from Ishtal. Unfortunately, there just aren't many champions in this region that particularly grip me. That's not to say that I actually dislike any characters from Ishtal, save for maybe Zyra, but I guess an underdeveloped region lends itself to underdeveloped characters. That said, one champion from the jungles I do find somewhat compelling is Rengar. People like a good revenge story, and Rengar definitely fits the bill on that front. Born to a tribe of tiger Vastaya called the Kilosh, Rengar was exiled from an early age for being the runt of the litter. In spite of that, he learned to fight and survive in the harsh jungles, in part thanks to a hunter who took him in, a nice callback to his original lore. Eventually, that hunter parted ways with him, and Rengar returned to his tribe seeking to earn his place back amongst their ranks. Unfortunately, the chief, his own father, would allow Rengar back if he were to claim a trophy from a void beast who had plagued Kumungu for years. Kha'Zix. After a long and grueling hunt, Rengar and Kha'Zix came to blows in a battle that would ultimately result in both fleeing each other with injuries, thus beginning a long rivalry between the two. Ultimately, even though he failed on his hunt, Rengar came to realize that his father, who so readily scolded Rengar for his failure, hadn't actually claimed any new trophies in years. The aging Kailash leader had become complacent in his position of power, and sent Rengar to kill Kha'Zix not as a test of worth, but simply because he'd become too scared to do it himself. Thus, Rengar slew his own father and set out to hone his skills as a hunter, hoping to one day finish what he'd started and hunt down the ultimate game in the form of Kha'Zix, a beast who kept evolving and adapting with every prey it devoured. Rengar's story is simple but effective. Where he first sought only to earn his clan's approval, Rengar realized that he doesn't need it, and set out to surpass his father and those who had shunned him. He's a cunning and ruthless hunter, but also prideful and, to a degree, honorable. If there's any Ishtali champion I'm interested in following, it's definitely the Pride Stalker. Let's just hope that the next time he shows up, Riot doesn't devolve his personality into dumb cat jokes again. Okay, so this one might be cheating a little, but screw it. My list, my rules. Nami isn't technically from Bilgewater, but she's designated as part of the region in Legends of Runeterra, and to me that's good enough of an excuse to talk about her. Nami is yet another champion with peak protagonist energy. But unlike some of the others on this list, she's sadly underdeveloped and underutilized. Truth be told, her story hasn't really progressed since her introduction, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Nami belongs to a race of aquatic Fastaya called the Mirai, who actually live in the seas west of Targon. The Mirai are a fairly prosperous people, but they do have one big obstacle to contend with: the Void, or as they call it, the Murk. See, the Mirai live near a deep, dark trench, at the bottom of which is a void portal. For generations, they've kept the Void's abominations at bay using the power of moonstones, which are imbued with celestial magic. The trouble is, moonstones don't last forever, and so the Mirai have to occasionally make a voyage up to the surface to trade with the Lunari. In exchange for a moonstone, the Mirai gift the Lunari with an abyssal pearl, found in the depths where the void festers. Why the Lunari want or need such a thing is unclear, but that's a topic for a different video. The point is, retrieving an abyssal pearl is a task usually given to the tribe's Tidecaller, someone of exceptional skill and resolve permitted to wield an ancient elemental staff. Originally, Nami was not meant to be the Tidecaller, as that honor was given to a Mirai warrior named Rasho. Unfortunately, he never returned, and the Mirai were running out of time as their moonstone's glow dimmed. It was Nami who, despite the urgings of others, dove in after Rasho not only to retrieve the abyssal pearl and the Tidecaller staff, but to put the poor guy out of his misery, as he wound up corrupted by the void. In the end, Nami became the hero her people needed, despite not being chosen for the task, but the Mirai's troubles wouldn't end there. When Nami made her way to the surface, no one came to trade, probably thanks to the Solari and their entire purging of the Moon People. Now, Nami travels all across Runeterra in search of the moonstone her people need. Nami's story seems fairly basic, but really, the main appeal of her has always been her character. She's not a chosen one. She's not really a warrior, and there are quite possibly others more suited to the task in front of her. Even so, Nami is the only one brave enough to see it through, to dive into an abyss filled with eldritch horrors when no one else would, to leave her home behind in search of the one thing that can save everyone she holds dear. Nami is, at heart, a girl determined to protect her loved ones in spite of how overwhelming the task in front of her might be, and I do hope we'll get to see where the tides carry her next in the near future. Alright, so, I'll be completely honest here. I've never been all that invested in any particular character from the Shadow Isles. Given that most of the region's champions are just monsters intent on bringing suffering to the realm of the living, there's not a whole lot of depth to most of the roster. Sure, I can appreciate the tragedy of Callista being a noble soldier reduced to a soul mindlessly pursuing vengeance for the sake of it, or the raw sadistic energy of someone like Thresh, who knows he's evil and revels in it, but, well, I kinda have to retract points on account of those concepts already having been done by other characters before. Add in my lingering resentment for the entire Sentinels of Light event and what it did for these characters, and, well, who's left? At the end of the day, I narrowed it down to two choices: Maokai or Yorick. Upon further deliberation, I just barely gotta give it to Maokai. Once a nature spirit on the Blessed Isles, Maokai was practically the land's own patron deity, or at least the closest thing they had to one. He protected the forests and bestowed the most worthy humans with the waters of life, which could seemingly heal any ailment or injury. When Viego came and unleashed the Black Mist, there was sadly little that Maokai could do to stop it, but he could ensure that a seed of hope remained. Maokai absorbed as much of the sacred water into himself as he could from deep underground, using its revitalizing energy to resist the ruination that corrupted everything else it touched. Since that fateful day, the nature spirit has been doing everything in his power to help the forests of the Isles bloom again, in spite of the vengeful rays that seek to snuff out all traces of life. It might seem like a fool's errand, growing a forest in the middle of the Black Mist, and yet it may not be as implausible as it seems. With the waters of life flowing through him, Maokai not only has the strength to resist ruination, but he can also create seeds and saplings resilient against its curse. I think what appeals to me so much about Maokai is that he's so devoted to his cause. Technically, there's nothing stopping him from just leaving the Isles behind, and the bio even says as much. However, Maokai is not content to just leave everything he once cared for in ruin. He stubbornly persists against the curse plaguing his homeland, and uses all the power at his disposal to help life bloom in a place that's naturally hostile toward it. As much as I love Yorick's plan of fighting the army of the undead with his own army of the undead, Maokai fits the theme of protecting the last seed of hope way better, in my opinion. Also, when you really stop and think about it, Yorick's lore is kind of just a repeat of Maokai's, so I have to subtract points for redundancy. But time will tell if that seed will ever grow into anything substantial. Similar to the Shadow Isles, it's tough to pick a favorite champion from the Void in terms of character. We're dealing with another region where the majority of champions are ultimately just monsters, which means that you kind of have to judge them by a different standard. There are exceptions, of course. Kai'Sa and Kassadin are humans using the Void's own power against it, and I do really like them. Kassadin is basically trying to be League's Doomslayer by waging a one-man crusade against an eldritch hell dimension, while Kai'Sa is a survivor simply trying to last one more day against a foe she feels she has no hope of actually beating. Then you have Bel'Veth and Vel'Koz, who both explore the true horror of the Void's potential to learn and adapt in different ways. However, I'm going to cheat a little again and talk about another character with ties to the Void, even if he's not technically considered a Void champion. Jax has a fascinating history in League's roster. Initially something of a gag character who had no lore beyond just being so OP he canonically had to be nerfed, Riot has turned him into the last survivor of a nation destroyed by the Void, who carries a literal last light of hope with him as he travels Runeterra. Maybe you can sense a bit of a theme with the sorts of characters I enjoy, but what can I say? Jax is just awesome. In fact, you could say Jax's entire story is centered around rebellion. He was a renowned soldier in Acacia's army who stood in defiance of Shurima's enslavement of his people. Jax wasn't a leader or a king, but he was one of the few mortal warriors in all of history capable of dealing a killing blow to an Ascended. That's something that even other Ascended themselves struggle to do. Sadly, Shurima had a whole host of these demigods at their disposal, so Acacia turned to a greater power to drive off the Ascended host. That same power would more or less end up destroying their entire civilization and unleashing hordes of monsters on the desert. Oops. In spite of all the horrors he's witnessed, though, Jax found a reason to keep going even as everything he once knew and loved was literally unmade right in front of him. A single staff imbued with elemental fire burned amid the chaos, a tiny flame that even the Void struggled to snuff out. His staff became a beacon of hope, and now Jax aims to rebuild the Kohari, the elite band of warriors once revered as defenders of his people. I know Riot really wants to make Kai'Sa the protagonist of the Void storyline, but I think Jax is way more deserving of that honor, and I sincerely hope we'll get to see more of his story play out in the near future as he works to build an army against an unstoppable Eldritch force. You know, it's kind of funny. When I first started playing League, I really didn't care much for Vegar. I found him annoying and kind of one note as a character. A Yordle who gets angry about being called short. He's a joke villain who wants to be taken seriously but isn't due to his stature and general inability to actually do anything wicked beyond mild mischief. I didn't hate the guy per se, but I certainly wouldn't have considered him my favorite Yordle. So, leave it to Riot to turn him into what he is, in my opinion, one of the best written characters in the game. Frankly, Vegar deserves a whole video of his own to explain the nuance of the character's history, but let's just focus on his current canon bio for the time being. Vegar started out as a scholar, a Yordle who studied celestial magic, and proved to be surprisingly skilled with it. This earned him the attention of Mordekaiser, who trapped Vegar and forced him to use his cosmic sorcery for the Iron Revenant's benefit. Little by little, Vegar's mind and appearance were warped, until he barely even remembered his previous life. And when Mordekaiser was eventually forced back into the Death Realm, Vegar set out clad in the dark attire of a warlock to become the land's new tyrannical overlord. Only, he's not as tyrannical as he makes himself out to be. Vegar is arguably one of the most powerful mages on Runeterra, but when it comes to being evil, he just doesn't quite stack up. Literally. Not only does he lack the innate cruelty of some of League's more fearsome villains, Vegar's attempts to be seen as a master of dark magic leads him to pick fights with and defeat other dark mages, which, in the process, ironically makes him seem more like a hero and a champion to those he inadvertently liberates. But here's the real genius of Vegar's new lore. Yordles are spiritual creatures, whose personalities are somewhat malleable and can be shaped by their environments. In the current lore, Yordles basically become parodies of the places they inhabit. Heimerdinger is a mad scientist obsessed with invention because he lives in Piltover, a city built around the idea of scientific progress and innovation. Kled is a roaming madman who considers any land he settles on to be his property and violently defends it, mirroring Noxus's expansionist empire and their often brutal conquests. By that same token, Vegar is a reflection of Mordekaiser and his empire, built of cruelty and the excessive use of dark magic. With that in mind, all of Vegar's more comedic elements, while still amusing, have a surprisingly deeper meaning behind them. He wants to be an evil overlord because he once lived in the shadows of one. He hates being called short, likely because, well, Mordekaiser is a towering suit of metal to most humans. So to a Yordle, the guy must be a literal titan. I mean, Vegar even made himself a freaking mech to seem taller in Legends of Runeterra. You know, a giant metal suit. It's honestly one of the most clever retcons Riot has ever done, taking two characters who initially had nothing to do with each other and connecting their lore in a way that genuinely works. Vegar is still a comedic character, but he's no longer a walking one-note joke. For that, and that alone, I have to say he's easily become one of my favorites. So there you have it. These are my personal favorite champion stories from each region or faction in Runeterra. Of course, this list is entirely subjective, so if you disagree, feel free to politely leave your own picks down in the comments below. Until then, have a good day or evening, and I'll see you all next time.